Picture this. You just spent an evening with people you genuinely like. The conversation was good. Nobody was difficult. Nothing went wrong. And yet, the moment you close the front door behind you, you feel it. A deep, bone-level exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. Your body feels heavy. Your mind feels scraped clean. You need to sit in silence for a long time before you feel like yourself again. And then comes the question you always ask yourself after these moments. What is wrong with me? Here's what nobody tells you. That feeling, that specific kind of tired that only happens after being around people, is not a personality flaw. It is not anxiety. It is not rudeness in disguise. It is a neurological process. And once you understand what is actually happening inside your brain and body during social interaction, everything about this experience starts to look completely different. Because here is what I have come to understand. People who feel emotionally drained after social events are not less capable of connection. They are not damaged. They are not antisocial. They are people whose nervous systems are doing significantly more work during social interaction than most people ever realize. And that work has a cost. Today, I want to break that down for you. The science, the psychology, the identity layer underneath it, and what it actually means about who you are. Because I believe that most people who carry this experience have been misreading it their entire lives. And once you see it clearly, you will never feel broken for it again. Let's start with what is actually happening inside your brain when you are in a social situation. Because most people have no idea, and it completely changes the way you should think about this. Your brain during a social interaction is not doing one thing. It is doing many things simultaneously. It is processing language and meaning. It is reading facial microexpressions, tone of voice, body language, and emotional subtext. It is monitoring how you are being perceived. It is managing your own emotional responses in real time. It is retrieving memories to inform context. It is predicting what the other person might say or feel next. And it is doing all of this at the same time, continuously, for the entire duration of the interaction. For most people, much of this processing happens automatically in the background. Their brain filters out a large percentage of incoming social data and focuses only on the surface of the conversation. They hear the words, they catch the basic tone, they move on. But for a significant portion of the population, that filter is not nearly as aggressive. The brain takes in far more. It processes far more. It responds to far more. And all of that processing consumes enormous amounts of cognitive and emotional energy. Psychologist Elaine Aron, whose research on what she calls the highly sensitive person has been studied for over 3 decades, found that approximately 20% of the population has a nervous system that is fundamentally more responsive to stimulation. Not more fragile, more responsive, more attuned, more activated by input. What this means in practice is that a social event which registers as mildly stimulating for the average person registers as intensely stimulating for you. You are not imagining the exhaustion. You are not being dramatic. You are running a more resource-intensive operating system, and you have just spent several hours at full capacity. Now, I want to go deeper than the biology, because the nervous system piece is only the beginning. There is a concept in psychology called emotional labor. It was first described by sociologist Arlie Hochschild in her research on service workers, but it applies far beyond professional settings. Emotional labor is the process of managing your feelings and expressions in order to fulfill the emotional requirements of a social situation. Every time you smile, when you are not sure you feel like smiling. Every time you match someone else's energy, even when yours is lower. Every time you monitor your responses to make sure you are coming across the right way. Every time you absorb the mood of the room and adjust your behavior accordingly, you are doing emotional labor. And here is the thing. Most people who feel drained after social events are not simply introverted. They are performing enormous amounts of invisible emotional labor throughout every interaction, often without even realizing it. You track how everyone in the room is feeling. You notice when someone seems left out and subtly shift the conversation to include them. You sense when the energy drops and you work to lift it. You pick up on tension between two people and quietly navigate around it. You monitor your own presence constantly, wondering if you are talking too much, not enough, being interesting, being too much. None of this is conscious decision making. It happens automatically. It is your nervous system doing what it was trained to do, but it is deeply physically exhausting. And when the event ends and you finally close that door, your body is releasing an enormous amount of tension that it has been holding for hours. The silence afterward is not emptiness, it is recovery. Here's where it gets interesting, because what I really want to talk about is not just the science. I want to talk about what this pattern says about you and about the relationship you have been building, often unconsciously, with your own social experience. Behavioral psychology is very clear on one thing. We do not just behave. We interpret our behavior. And the interpretation you give to the feeling of social exhaustion says everything about how you see yourself. If every time you feel drained after being with people, your internal narrative is, there is something wrong with me, I am broken, I am not like other people, then you are doing something very specific. You are taking a neurological event, a real, measurable, physiologically grounded experience, and you are turning it into an identity statement. You are telling yourself a story about who you are. And that story, repeated enough times, becomes what you believe you are. Identity-based habit theory, rooted in decades of cognitive behavioral research, shows us that the labels we apply to our experience shape our sense of self. If you consistently interpret your social exhaustion as evidence that you are incapable, deficient, or fundamentally different in a bad way, you will begin to build your entire social identity around avoiding situations that produce that feeling. You will start saying no to things before they happen, not because you actually do not want to go, but because you have preemptively decided that you cannot handle it. You will pull back from people you care about because the cost feels too high. You will accumulate evidence for the story that you are simply not a person who can do social life. And none of that is true. It is just a story that filled the space where understanding should have been. Let me be completely honest with you about something that most people who experience this have never fully considered. A significant part of what you feel after social events is not the result of the event itself. It is the result of how you were in the event. Think about the last time you were with a group of people and felt genuinely comfortable. Not performing, not monitoring, not adjusting, just present. In those moments, the exhaustion afterward is usually much less. Sometimes it is barely there at all. Now compare that with the interactions where you spent most of the time worrying about how you were coming across, where you were monitoring every word, where you were managing other people's emotional states, where you were being the version of yourself you thought was most acceptable in that room. The difference in exhaustion between those two experiences is enormous, and it points to something crucial. Large part of the drain is not contact with people. It is the cost of self-surveillance during contact with people. Psychologists call this self-monitoring. It is the degree to which a person actively regulates and controls the image they project in social situations. High self-monitors are constantly aware of how they are being perceived. They adjust their behavior based on the signals they receive from others. They are, in a sense, performing continuously, and performance is exhausting. The people who seem to float through social events without losing any energy are often not people with more social capacity. They are people with less self-surveillance. They are not constantly editing themselves. They are not running a parallel track of internal commentary while simultaneously participating in conversation. They are simply there. That is the gap, not your nervous system, not your personality. The mental overhead of existing in a social space while simultaneously judging your existence in that social space. Now, I want to go to a deeper layer, because this does not happen in a vacuum. This level of self-monitoring has a history, and understanding that history changes everything. Research in developmental psychology is clear on this. Children who grew up in environments where they had to constantly read and manage the emotional states of the adults around them develop what is sometimes called hypervigilant empathy. Their nervous systems learn at a very early age that the safest strategy in a social environment is to always know what everyone around you is feeling, to always be aware of how your behavior is landing and to adjust constantly. This is not a character flaw. It is a survival adaptation. When you cannot predict how the adults in your world will react, and the emotional weather of your home shifts without warning, the brain's solution is to become an expert at reading the room. It becomes a full-time emotional meteorologist. And here is what nobody tells you about that adaptation. It does not turn off when you grow up. The nervous system that learned to hyper-monitor social environments in childhood does not simply reset when you move into adulthood. You carry it with you into every room, every gathering, every conversation. So when you arrive at a social event and your nervous system immediately begins scanning, tracking, managing, and absorbing, it is not because you are weak or overly sensitive. It is because your brain is doing exactly what it was trained to do. It is being vigilant. It is being adaptive. It is trying to keep you safe. The problem is that what once kept you safe now keeps you exhausted. Here is one of the most important things I can offer you today, because I want to give you something practical, not just a framework for understanding. There is a specific distinction that I believe is the most important one in this entire conversation, and almost nobody makes it. The distinction between solitude as recovery and solitude as withdrawal. Recovery solitude is intentional. It is the deliberate, conscious act of giving your nervous system the rest it needs after a period of high stimulation. You are not hiding. You are not running away. You are refueling. You are doing for your mind what sleep does for your body. You are returning to yourself. Withdrawal solitude is reactive. It is what happens when the exhaustion becomes so normalized that you begin preemptively avoiding social situations to protect yourself from the feeling. You are not recovering. You are contracting, and over time, contraction becomes the pattern. The difference between these two is not always obvious from the outside, but from the inside, the difference is enormous. Recovery solitude feels like relief. Withdrawal solitude feels like relief that slowly turns into loneliness. Many people who experience chronic social exhaustion have unknowingly crossed the line from the first to the second. They are not choosing solitude because they need it in this moment. They are choosing it because they have quietly decided that social connection is simply not worth the cost. And if that is where you are, I want you to hear this. That is not a conclusion about who you are. That is a conclusion about the conditions in which you have been doing connection. And conditions can change. Let me address something directly because I keep seeing it. And I think it is one of the most misunderstood aspects of this experience. There is a significant difference between being drained by social events and being drained by specific kinds of social events. Most people who describe themselves as someone who always drains after being with people have never actually mapped out which events drain them and which do not. They have taken a pattern, noticed it a few times, and generalized it into a universal truth about themselves. But pay close attention, because when you actually examine the data, almost always the picture is more specific than that. The events that drain you most tend to share certain characteristics. They involve large groups where you cannot have real conversation. They involve people with whom you cannot be fully yourself. They involve environments that are loud, chaotic, or unpredictable. They involve extended periods of small talk with no meaningful depth. They involve social dynamics where you feel the need to perform or manage perceptions. The events that drain you least tend to have different characteristics: one-on-one or very small groups, people you trust completely, conversations that actually go somewhere, environments where the pressure to perform is low, situations where you are allowed to simply exist rather than present. This is not a coincidence. The variable is not social contact. The variable is the quality and safety of the connection within that contact. This matters enormously, because if you have decided that you are simply someone who cannot do social events, but the real truth is that you are someone who cannot do performative, shallow, high-stimulation social events, then your self-diagnosis is off by an important degree. And an inaccurate self-diagnosis leads to the wrong prescription. Here is the practical side of this, because I want to give you something you can actually use starting today. The first thing, begin tracking your social exhaustion with more precision. After any social event, Instead of simply noting that you feel drained, ask yourself a few more specific questions. How many people were there? How deep were the conversations? How much were you monitoring yourself? How safe did you feel to simply be? How much energy did you spend managing others' emotional states? You will start to see patterns very quickly, and those patterns will tell you something far more useful than the generalization that being with people exhausts you. The second thing, redefine recovery. If you currently recover from social events by disappearing entirely into screens, distraction, or numbing, I want to challenge you to try something different. True nervous system recovery is active, not passive. It involves things that actually restore your regulatory capacity. Quiet movement, walking, gentle stretching, time in nature, creative activity done alone, journaling, slow breathing. These are not just nice ideas. They are neurologically regulatory activities that help your parasympathetic nervous system return to baseline. Scrolling social media does not do that. It often extends the stimulation. The third thing, and I consider this the most important one, give yourself permission to be honest about your needs before the event, not just after it. Most people who experience chronic social exhaustion suffer not just from the drain itself, but from the shame and confusion that comes after it. They push themselves into social situations without acknowledging what they actually need. Then they feel guilty for being affected by it. Then they white-knuckle through the recovery. There is another way. You can acknowledge before a gathering that you will likely need quiet time afterward and plan for it. You can communicate to the people close to you that this is how your nervous system works, not as an apology, but as information. You can set the conditions of the event so that they better match your actual tolerance. Leave earlier than feels necessary. Choose environments where real conversation is possible. Suggest smaller gatherings when you have the option. This is not selfishness. This is self-knowledge applied with intention. I want to close with what I consider the most important point in everything we have discussed today, and it has nothing to do with recovery strategies or nervous system biology. It is about the story you tell yourself about this experience. Because here is what I have observed. The people who suffer most from social exhaustion are not necessarily the ones who feel the most drained. They are the ones who interpret the drain as evidence of failure. They leave gatherings not just tired but ashamed. They do not just need quiet. They need the quiet to also contain the thought that they are fundamentally insufficient, that they should be able to do this better, that normal people do not need this much recovery, that something essential is missing in them. And that additional layer, the shame narrative layered on top of the exhaustion, is what turns a manageable neurological reality into a painful identity crisis. Here's what I want you to hold instead. Your nervous system's sensitivity is not a defect. It is the same sensitivity that allows you to pick up on things others miss, to feel things more fully, to connect, when connection is genuine, at a depth that others rarely experience. The very mechanism that makes social events costly is also the mechanism that makes the meaningful ones irreplaceable. You do not need to become someone who can absorb unlimited social input without cost. That is not the goal. The goal is to understand what you actually need, to honor it without guilt, and to build a social life that is sized and shaped for the kind of person you actually are, rather than the kind of person you thought you were supposed to be. Because here is what I believe. The people who feel most drained after being with others are often the same people who are capable of the most profound connection. They just need the conditions to be right. They need safety. They need depth. They need to be with people who do not require them to perform. That is not asking too much. That is simply knowing yourself. And the version of you that builds a life around that knowledge, that chooses depth over volume, that recovers without shame, that understands its own nervous system as a feature rather than a flaw. That version of you shows up for the people who matter with more presence, more honesty, and more genuine warmth than someone who has never had to think about any of this at all. So the next time you close that door and sink into the silence and feel that familiar bone-deep exhale, I want you to try something different. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" try asking what my nervous system just did for me. Because the answer is that it showed up, it processed, it felt, it participated fully in the experience of being with other people. And now it needs to come home to itself. That is not a weakness. That is just the price and the privilege of being the kind of person who actually feels things. Thank you so much for being here today. If something in this episode landed for you, leave a comment and tell me which part. I read every single one. And if you are someone who has been carrying this quietly for a long time, I hope today you feel even a little less alone in it.